All right. So thank you, Gibran, and thank you, Shani, for joining us on this webinar for the Smiley community. Maybe we can start with you, Gibran. If you can give us your thoughts on the economic outlook in Kenya and in the region, and just shed some light on what you think the outlook for Kenya and the region is.
Sure, thanks, Alia. So I think, I mean, firstly, we don't live in a bubble, so we have to be conscious of the global economic environment that we live in. And I think the shock that we are facing today is one that no economist has modeled in the recent past. We've got a whole health shock that's going into a economic shock, and I think globally we know that a lot of advanced economies will fall into recession. I'm talking about the likes of the US, the China, the European Union. And I think, despite lower oil prices and a lot of people saying that we should celebrate as East Africa, I think there's going to be a severe economic impact on regional economies, in East Africa as well. So, for example, our exports rely on Europe for the flour exports, for instance, and a lot of luxury spending has gone down in the European Union, which is not good for flour exports. But at the same time, because global supply chains have been disrupted from COVID-19 and everything associated with it, our manufacturers are also facing delays in materials. So I think it's a bit of a broad impact. There are certain sectors like tea that haven't been hit quite hard as of yet. But as you know, the tourism sector is more or less in cardiac arrest. Capacity is close to 0%, understandably because of the cross-border travel restrictions. So the tourism sector, the floriculture sector, not doing too well. But overall, I think because Kenya remains a diversified economy, and because it looks like the tea sector is still performing okay, I think we could just avoid 1 and 3% with regards to GDP growth, which is nothing to celebrate about. But I think in relative terms, when we compare it and look back, we're probably going to compare ourselves to the likes of South Africa, Nigeria, perhaps even Angola, and all those other economies are going to be facing technical recessions. So I think we could celebrate that we are growing, but I mean, the growth's not going to be enough. But again, I think, it's difficult times to model as an economist because we've never seen anything like it. And the reason I say that is because whenever there's episodes of economic contraction or economic depression, economists and central bankers typically formulate strategies to get people out of their house to spend. But we have to make sure that we keep we keep people's pockets deep, but we don't want them to leave their house. So this is something that's never happened. I mean, how do you actually stimulate the economy by forcing people to stay indoors? So to stay indoors, and I think that is something that we think about. And of course, again, I'm not an authority to speak on the health side. I'm an economist, but we do acknowledge that the health capacity of the country was generally quite weak. And I think for the broader sub-Saharan Africa as well, I mean, there were talks that enough ICU, I suspect, started investing in that over the past 1 month. And because we have such a large informal sector that lives in informal settlements with a weak infrastructure capacity, we were obviously concerned that if it does spread like wildfire in our part of the world. And unfortunately, we may not have had the adequate ability to test for it, to contain it, actually.
Okay. Thanks. Thanks, Gibran. And Shani, from your perspective, given the companies that you interact with, how are they coping with it? And what are some of the mechanisms that they've put in place to try and cope with this?
So I think the way I see this is generally it's going to be kind of a four-stage approach. So you've got, of course, the focus was really on survival, physical survival, health and safety, personal, family of your staff in your office or in your businesses. That was critical to make sure that everybody was safe and healthy. You've installed and you've taken the necessary precautions that you need to take. The second one, of course, is more tactical in nature, which is essentially cash conservation. cash conservation at a personal level and cash conservation at a company level, right? At a business level. And that's what we are all kind of grappling with at the moment, right? How do we make sure that we can survive month, 2 month, 3 month, 4 month, whatever, however long it takes us to get through this. That's quite challenging. People are, of course, deploying all kinds of strategies to ensure that happens, which means you've got cost-cutting measures taking place. You've got rescheduling of your obligations. So you're talking to your banks about restructuring, getting a principal and/or interest moratorium. You're talking to your suppliers. You're talking to your landlords about cutting down or reducing rent or deferring partial rent payments. You are also going to be engaging with your staff, talking about possibility of reducing salaries, sending people on unpaid leave.
Yeah.
I think the trick here is you've got to have early and open conversation and communication with all the stakeholders that you're dealing with, right? So you've got to engage them early, a month or two in advance, to make sure that they understand. And it's a global issue. People have some sympathies. So we at a company level have done the same. I see a number of our clients doing the same. Is that early engagement with all the stakeholders. Okay. I think the third one is what I would call short-term strategic initiatives.
Okay.
So the idea is, while we are in this period of semi-lockdown or lockdown or quarantine, how do we survive? How do we are able to, so cost cutting is one side, but how do we ensure that we can generate some cash flows, right? As a company, as a business. So what are the things we can do differently, right? So take, for example, textile industries. Many of them have switched to masks and other gears, Look at hotels. Hospitality industry has been very hard hit, but some of the hotels have actually started housing the people in quarantine, right? So that's another way of thinking about survival. So you've got to look at your skill set, your service offering, your product offering, and you've got to look at the current environment and say, what can I do? Something that's within my niche, within my expertise, but something that speaks to the current going on.
Okay.
Critical. We as a firm are doing the same. We are actually, we have always been focused on advising, doing restructuring work for clients with lenders and the banks, and we have just expanded that practice quite a bit. Okay. And we're now working with banks, large banks, to do that work. So everybody has got to figure out, look at their own area of expertise as individuals, as firms, and see what can they do. So it's critical. That's now in the short term. In the long term, of course, post-COVID, the world will be different. You've got to just figure out then is what's going to happen. So critically, I see one of the key areas is going to be the basic necessities like food and the necessary non-food items, right? These are going to be, there is a global conversation and a concern that there could be a global shortage if this lockdown in various countries goes on for a while, right? So as it is, importation into Kenya has declined, right? So if you look at cereals, if you look at maize, wheat, rice, basic food commodities and non-food commodities, it has started to reduce because, of course, the countries where it's coming from, they're also concerned about food security. So we've got to think about what does it mean from a preparation point of view? What does it mean from an opportunity point of view? So a lot of the local producers are ramping up to make sure that they can meet a certain level of the demand. Now, many of the mid-sized companies, large-sized companies have been working with Kenya Association of Manufacturing and the task force set up by the government to ensure that the operations of their businesses continue during this curfew/quarantine period and continue if there is a lockdown, right? So these are some of the critical things you have to you have to make sure that you're in continuous conversation with all the stakeholders, regulators, to go on with.
Okay, so I think let me just go back to Gibran on that, because you mentioned food security as one thing, and Gibran mentioned something like the tea sector hasn't been impacted as much now. Gibran, what other sectors do you feel in the agribusiness have been impacted, or if not now, how soon before they are impacted?
Yeah, I mean, there's probably, we have to look for silver linings in the clouds. I mean, definitely. But if you look at the official numbers from the tea brokers this morning, I saw it on Bloomberg, Kenya's year-on-year tea production is up. And we speak to a lot of our clients at the Mombasa tea auction, and, mostly it's been uninterrupted so far. So yeah, I think tea probably a positive story in a very sort of depressing outlook, if you will. Floriculture, as I said, not great. Luxury spending gone down in Europe. Horticulture, which is obviously the fruits and veggies, the clients and the corporates that supply directly to supermarkets have been relatively okay, but the other sort of smaller scale players in this space have been impacted quite a bit. And as I said, I mean, we glean for winners and losers, but the reality is that it's a simultaneous supply and demand shock. So even manufacturers, for example, Alia, I mean, if sort of sector that relies on raw materials for any sort of agri product, they told us that China is making concerted efforts to restart their factories. And a lot of their suppliers in China are kind of shoving down supplies down their throat and saying, we're ready, do you want this? And the issue is that our manufacturers, or the industry group here, are saying that, yeah, it's fine. I mean, you could give me 90 days credit, and that's great that China is back, if you believe Chinese numbers on infections. But who are we going to sell it to? It's been locked down in Rwanda, in Uganda, in DRC, Burundi, the economies in the region that we supply to. So I think the simultaneous impact on supply and demand becomes an issue. But as I said, right now, I think the only light at the end of the tunnel, from what I can see, the clients I speak to, the numbers I look at, is tea. But unfortunately, the thing about COVID-19 as a macroeconomist for me is the longer the impact, the more severe or acute the shock will be on economic output. So if you price in a base case that COVID's going to end by June, then the impact could be a lot more mild on your economic assessment of future output. But if you believe that we're going to have an extended COVID period all the way through to Q3 this year, the first quarter next year, extended lockdowns, retrenchments, decline in investment, then of course the outlook's going to be a lot more grim, a lot more worse than we currently price in. And I struggle to see one sector that will say we're insulated. I think everybody will somewhat get impacted. I'll give you an example for tea earlier. The biggest buyers of Kenyan tea is Egyptians and the Pakistanis. And for any reason, if there's an extended COVID period there as well, I mean, people are going to be indoor and they're going to be drinking more tea. But if supply chains get disrupted, we can't move containers up or down, or for any reason, if people's pockets are not and/or Pakistan, our tea sector will also be impacted too.
Yeah. Okay. I think just touching on that, the government has tried to come in and put together what we could call a stimulus package. Maybe what are your thoughts, Gibran, first, in terms of that stimulus package, and will it have the desired effect that the government would like it to have? And then we can move to Shanif to say, from a business perspective, what are your thoughts on that package, and will it have the effect that you would want?
Sure. So we've done a lot of work in this in the past couple of weeks at Standard Bank Research, that is. And so there are two effects. I mean, the central bank's done what they could, or, still doing what they can. And then we've got the fiscal policy response that is still being deliberated, probably the second reading. I'm a bit concerned about the copy-paste model from the Western world. I think if you look at the issues that we face here, it's probably very different, because I'll give you an example of a monthly cash of something to the tune of £1,000. Canada is doing something similar, I think, with $1,500 in the US as well, a similar range. I mean, they have national insurance numbers. They have, council tax registrars, for example. So if there's someone living in a borough, they know where that person is. They know how many dependents they've got, and they can, directly target and provide that stimulus to that vulnerable person in society. In our part of the world, I mean, in the advice that we've been giving to the government, we do acknowledge that as I said again, we want people to spend, we want companies to hire, we don't want people to retrench, but at the same time, we don't want people to leave their houses for the foreseeable future, maybe 1 to 2 months. So how do we do that? I mean, monetary policy, the central bank has cut rates by 100 basis points to 7.25. They cut the cash reserve ratio by 100 basis points to 4.25. But unfortunately, asset quality out there has deteriorated. Now, as Shanif, sort of rightly mentioned, we will be providing restructures. We have to be lenient with regards to any client that's been impacted on COVID. But the reality is that, we can't really extend credit wholeheartedly as a commercial bank, despite the rate cuts from the central bank, in an environment where every single sector is getting impacted by COVID. I mean, this is on paper. Maybe you could think of me as an economist working for a bank speaking about this, not to sound biased. But I think that is my independent view as an economist. And then if you look at the fiscal policy side, on the other hand, I mean, before we go to the fiscal policy side, I think in fairness to the central bank, the reason the central bank has done what they did is to avoid a credit crunch in the banking sector. Even though they're not going to get us out of our houses to spend, they had to ensure that our very segmented banking sector remains liquid. So you're seeing similar approaches by the Bank of Uganda, for example, to try and ensure that everybody remains liquid, even though they may not extend credit wholeheartedly. On the fiscal policy side, as you guys know, we've got the tax laws amendment bill being discussed in the House this week and next week. And there's a sense of urgency that the executive wants to spearhead this procedure, or sort of get these reforms in very quickly before the end of the month. And just like taxes, I mean, any tax reform, it's like taking away from the right hand, giving to the left hand. And we've seen a proposal to cut VAT to 14%. That interestingly doesn't need presidential assent, because there was a parliamentary approval for that. The ones that need presidential assent is a cut of turnover tax to 1%, I believe, from 3%, which is more for the informal sector and the SMEs. And then you've got a cut in payee to 25% from 30% for the high income bracket earners, a blanket cut for anyone earning less than 24,000 shillings to no tax. And corporate income tax has also been reduced to 25% from 30%. Again, all these measures are probably things that we would celebrate 6 months ago, when the economy we knew had underlying issues. But for COVID, it may not necessarily have an impact in terms of reviving or resuscitating what's actually needed to be revived. It may help our economy, in my view, after COVID. I think we were crying out for a tax stimulus for the longest time as a private sector. But again, I mean, a cut in VAT is not going to get people to hire more employees. Employees, it's not going to get factories to restart. So I think what we need is a significant and relentless drive to invest in health infrastructure. And I think we ultimately need to make targeted cash transfers. The problem is that we have an economy that lives hand to mouth. We don't have the fiscal ability to do that as a country, because of underlying public finance issues, ranging from the last 2 to 3 years. And where do you start, Ali? I mean, if you want to go to Kibera, Mathare, and provide the most vulnerable people 1,000 shillings a day, for example, because they have to work from home and we need to avert a contagion. If you manage to sort out your public finances and get it, where do you start? Do you rely on the Ministry of Labor with $1 billion to try and provision this or spread it out? We know how that ends up. So I mean, we are caught between a rock and a hard place right now. But I guess, in my view, the response had to be done. We need probably, if COVID goes beyond June, I think bilaterals, multilaterals, and even commercial creditors, unfortunately, will have to think about providing debt relief for at least 6 months. I mean, all these things have to come together. It has to be a coordinated effort. So on paper, I mean, as an economist, we struggle to see how this will be substantially helpful during COVID.
Okay.
What I'd rather want to see, Alia, is I would want to see a significant investment in health infrastructure, the protective gear, health workers, ICU beds, ventilators, isolation centers. I think that is what we need right now. But again, post-COVID, God willing, I think some of these measures will be quite welcome and will eventually be beneficial to us post-COVID.
Shanif, do you share the same views in terms of the impact that this so-called stimulus package is going to have?
Let me just make a couple of comments there. I think the first, just reiterating what Jibran said, is, Kenya doesn't have the capacity to be a welfare state.
Yeah.
Right. So that the challenge is going to be, if you provide cuts in certain areas, so all the relief that government is providing, where is it going to come from, right? Yeah. There's a lot of pressure from IMF, World Bank, to make sure that the tax collection stays at the level that it has been.
Of course.
Right? Which means that if you're going to take from this pocket, you have to give to somebody else. So, and that's very apparent if you look at the tax amendment bill. So what Jibran just talked about in terms of the relief, VAT reduction, corporate and income tax, etc. That's for the relief. But if you look at the tax amendment bill that's being discussed at Parliament, it talks about a number of other things, which may actually have a negative impact on the economy in the long term.
Okay.
To give you an idea, one of the strength of the East African private sector, or the Kenyan private sector, has been the investment allowances.
Yeah.
Right. The government has provided very generous investment allowances, which has spurred on year domestic investments. Right. So in the key urban areas and Nakuru, you can actually get a tax break on 100% of your tax allowance, all right, over a long period. And then outside of these urban areas, it's 150%. And if you notice that's why there is a lot of manufacturing and industrial activity even outside of Nairobi. Look at Athi River, look at Thika, Western Kenya. And a major part of it is actually this generous investment allowance. Now, of course, because of the pressure that the government faces in terms of maintaining overall tax collection under the new tax amendment bill, those are facing amendments to lower levels, right? For example, everything is now going to be at 100%. You have to be able to take up your investment allowance, the 50% of it in the first year, which is generally not possible.
Yeah.
You have to spread it out, generally takes 6-7 years. Restrictions on, type of assets that are allowed under it and over what period. All of these are coming in. So again, we need to be mindful, what does this tax amendment mean? The tax relief on one hand, and then the resultant tax amendment, what does it mean for the industry and manufacturing and SME sector in the post-COVID period? And it can be detrimental. So that's one thing. Is also that, each and every economy, and you've seen in what's happening in North America, in US, what's happening in Europe in terms of this push and pull between health and safety concern and the spread of pandemic versus the viability of economy concern, right? Yeah. So, President Trump is talking about, let's open the US economy on 1st of May, right? You've seen the European countries have started looking at some level of a structured step-by-step opening up rollout, right? Austria, Denmark, Germany has just announced last evening that they are going to look at it from May onwards. So unfortunately, I mean, that's the reality. At some point, the pressure is going to be too much not to resist the temptation of opening up. Right? And it's going to come to Kenya. Right now, we are in COVID mode, which means safety, security, health, prevent the contagion. But at some point, and I suspect in the next 2, 3, 4 weeks, the mindset will start changing as unemployment begins to climb, as many SMEs start not being able to pay their rents, not being able to pay their salaries, not being able to meet their obligations. That concern is going to come in. The one glimmer of hope for us is, I think, because we are, as Kenya, we are slightly behind the curve. We don't really necessarily need to reinvent. We can look at as it is. I mean, if you look at the quarantine and the curfew, a lot of these learnings we've taken from other countries who are ahead of us. Hopefully, we can take similar learnings in terms of the European countries or the Asian countries that are going to be starting opening up the economy slightly before. So what are the key milestones you need to set to start thinking about opening up? What needs to be done? So, for example, Gavin Newsom, the governor of California, just announced last evening, the 6 things that need to happen for them to open up. 6 steps that need to be taken. So the contagion is under vulnerable, can be in a safe environment, restaurants open, schools for the timing will open, selected manufacturing essential businesses will open, and so forth. So we will have to think about the same steps. And I suspect probably sooner than later, because as Gibran said, the longer we wait, the more negative the impact will be in the long run.
No, I agree. I think maybe just a question on something that is topical as well is the currency depreciation. We saw the shilling depreciate. I think, Gibran, this is for you, from levels of 101 going to 106. So what are your thoughts on that, and how much further do we expect the shilling to depreciate? And then maybe Shanif can come in and just talk about the impact that that's going to have again on businesses which are trying to reinvent themselves.
Yeah, I think, this is a bit of a, okay, look, so a few things first. My advice to corporates, or even, SMEs for that matter, anyone watching this, is to try to understand that economists and analysts, we do have a lot of data, but we're not crystal ball readers. And if you do have a significant exposure as an importer and exporter, always think about utilizing appropriate risk management strategies that certain institutions will give you, whether it's a vanilla forward, or an option. Because it's like when you leave your house, let's say you don't wear a seatbelt, and ask you why you don't wear a seatbelt. You say, because I don't think I'm going to get a car accident. But you wear your seatbelt anyways, because you could get an accident, or you may not get an accident. So similarly with currencies as well, as a company, always think about insuring yourself. I know at times with what's happening with the currency, as you know, the currency is a very sensitive issue in Kenya, which splits a lot of opinion. For long, many investors have believed that the Kenyan shilling has been overvalued. I'm not so sure about that. But I think there's been a bit of a intriguing sort of debate on why the currency is so stable. Now, even if you look at the past 1 month, yes, our currency is weakened. The dollar KES is weakened from 103 levels to 106, where we are right now. But compared to other currencies, let me take some G10 currencies, the euro dollar, the pound dollar, compared to what happened with the Uganda shilling initially, what's happened with the Zambian kwacha, what's happened with the South African rand, what's happened with the naira. I still think our currencies perform much better than those other economies. And what happened a month ago was a bout of global risk aversion when If you remember 4 weeks ago, the VIX index was all over the place, selling off. The dollar index was rallying. So the dollar is strengthening broadly across the board. And as I said at the beginning, we don't live in a bubble. So if there's such, incessant dollar strength, it will infectiously also come onto our shores. One thing that helps us in Kenya is that we don't have the level of hot money, which means we don't have too many foreigners holding our treasury bills and bonds in comparison to other markets like Nigeria, like Ghana, like South Africa, or even Uganda for that matter. So I think that in a way underpins our resilience. But for what it's worth, let's think about this. Yes, COVID's a unique shock. So oil prices have fallen, and Kenya is a net oil importer. And if you look at oil imports in our current account deficit, it's pivotal. Our oil imports actually account for nearly a third of total imports. So if oil prices are down by 65% since the beginning of the year, it has a substantial positive impact, at least on paper, for the currency, because oil coming flow. But the other issue is that remittances, diaspora remittances, could potentially suffer from what's happening globally. Remittances actually are our largest export earner, which brought in about $2.8 billion last year. Of course, there was a bit of amnesty money in that, but still it's quite substantial. So we're concerned that COVID might impact remittances negatively. And then conversely, from an export perspective, as I mentioned, we are concerned that whether it's floriculture, whether it's tourism, certain sectors, tourism sectors, export earners will be impacted as well. So it's a bit of a double whammy. So, what do we celebrate? Falling oil prices or weaker exports? What are we more concerned about? I think because imports are nearly 3 times larger than total exports, from a technical perspective, the currency can benefit more from such a sharp decline in imports. And I think this is why the central bank remains adamant and content to continue cutting interest rates despite what's happened with the currency, because they know it may not be sustainable. The other thing that's also very important is that forward guidance being given by the central bank at last month's Monetary Policy Committee meeting. Obviously, the central bank governor felt the need to signal to us, according by his own admission. He mentioned that the Kenyan government will receive about $1 to $1.5 billion in multilateral support from the World Bank for budgetary funding, which is about $750 million. And he mentioned that similar to other African economies, Kenya will also receive a rapid credit facility from the IMF. That could be 350, could be 500, could be $750 million. So the reason he felt the need to mention that to us is to reinstill confidence in the shilling. Because when his FX reserves grow, he'll have the ability to sell those dollars into the market. So I don't think the dollar shilling trend will become a one-way street by any means. In fact, from a strategy perspective, I would expect a bit of a bias over the next 1 month for a bit of an appreciation, especially given that they've announced a tap sale for the infrastructure bond. I suspect there could be a few foreigners who bring in money to get into the tap sale because they missed the primary auction as well. But again, Alia, as I said, this is what we see fundamentally. But remember, we don't live on an island. If global risk aversion throws another tantrum like it did 4 weeks ago, then the question, everything weakens against the dollar. Gold rallies, everybody buys a Swiss franc. And then it's a question of damage control. So that is something we can't control, because interestingly, what is driving global asset prices is the flattening of the curve, right? And as Shanif rightly mentioned, we hope that Kenya doesn't get too excited about a flatter curve so early in the day without mass testing. So for you to actually predict stable or some sanity or some semblance of neutrality being reinstilled into asset prices globally, you actually have to be convinced that the and good social distancing measures have worked for them. But again, from my side, it's very, very difficult to predict what the dollar will do globally, and that's what I think, Alia. is the biggest risk to our currency. Because just finally, if there is a lockdown like we have now, a partial dusk to dawn curfew, whatever you want to call it, presumably, I mean, Shanif will probably also shed light on this. A lot of companies are not operating at 100% capacity, so imports should generally, be very low.
Okay, Shanif, your comments on that?
Yeah, I mean, it's the same. Look, if you look at actually the depreciation in terms of the COVID impact, looks like it's about 2.5%. All right, because I think before COVID, the shilling was at about 102.5, 103, and the COVID impact took it to about 106, 107, and now it's about 105.5, 106. So it's about a 2.5% impact. Broadly, of course, Gibran is right that, I mean, the critical thing is what happens. Our import quantum is significantly larger than our export quantum, right? So, if we are commodity prices, does that mean that despite having lower export proceeds, may it be horticulture, floriculture, hospitality related, tourism related, or diaspora related, how does it balance out? Not sure entirely, but we need to watch and see. The challenge, I think, going forward is I think the first and foremost is everybody's kind of at this stage thinking about survival and costs, right? So of course, yes, the manufacturing activity has reduced. My sense is looking at again, this is very anecdotal, talking to a number of clients, is that in terms of manufacturing, there's probably a 25-30% reduction. All right. In manufacturing activity, a lot of it is, of course, to do with restrictions, supply chain restriction, physical movement restrictions, etc. So, what does it mean? I mean, cost cutting is a big issue. So, those who are borrowing in foreign currency, if they have to hedge, and if the cost of hedging pushes them to a similar level of borrowing as Kenyan shilling, then are they going to hedge or not? Do you need to hedge 100%? Do you need to hedge a portion that is required for debt servicing for a given period? What do you hedge? These are some of the questions that each and every company, whether it's a small company or a large company, is going to be thinking about. The other thing is that, are you able to pass on the cost of your foreign currency exposure to your end customers, right? So there are many industries. There are many industries in Kenya that have a very similar cost base because of importation. So look at anybody that's using commodities in their manufacturing process, may it be steel, may it be crude palm oil, may it be cement raw material products, clinker, cereals, they all have very similar cost base. So if they believe that they can pass on any foreign currency exposure to the end clients, then they will continue taking foreign currency positions and hope that they can pass it on to the end clients. Right. So it's not entirely clear, but you've got to kind of analyze the situation as you see how it impacts your specific business, and then make a decision.
Okay, I think maybe just to end, Gibran, what are your last thoughts in terms of the country's debt capacity and the impact on future growth?
Yeah, I think obviously pre-COVID there was an acceptance in the analyst community that Kenya's fiscal deficit was too high, and we were crying out for consolidation, meaning we wanted the budget deficit, the government to scale back on expenditure. Unfortunately, pre-COVID, the government would only consolidate, or at least show us consolidation on paper, by trying to grow tax revenues by an exorbitant and unrealistic level. Post-COVID, things are slightly different now because everybody is rightly, I'm talking about the likes of the IMF and other multilaterals will be a lot more lenient with regards to having elevated fiscal deficits as a percentage of GDP, because we inevitably have to ramp up expenditure on, social spending and healthcare, for example. And inevitably as well, admittedly, our tax receipts are going to falter on the back of weaker economic activity associated with COVID. So I think the fiscal deficit is going to be north of 8-9% this year as a percentage of GDP. I don't think there's going to be too many alarms. I mean, I would be very disappointed if Moody's and Fitch and S&P downgrade our sovereign rating on the back of that, because I mean, I was looking at the IMF World Economic Outlook, I think yesterday or the day before, and the US is expected to run a fiscal deficit of 16% of GDP from about 3% the year before, which again is unprecedented. But again, this is an unprecedented and very unique exogenous global shock that we are facing. So I think, Alia, I mean, again, depending on duration of COVID-19, it will ultimately define how strained our public finances will become. If things go back to normalcy by June, July, hopefully, then I don't even think we're going to get debt moratorium or debt relief by some of our multilateral, bilateral sort of donors, if you like. But I personally believe that post-COVID, I mean, we will have to scale back expenditure dramatically. My only concern is that, the whole BBI talk takes prominence again, and then the whole pre-election spending starts in 2021, 2022. I don't know how they're going to scale back on expenditure then. But I think a point that you need reallocation. So we know, when you give us tax benefits, you basically hit us hard on something else as well. And similarly, when you look at expenditure, what we as economists are advising the government, and I'm not sure if they're going to do it, is they have to reallocate away from capex and travel allowances for MCAs and MPs or the government, and reallocate that spending towards where it's needed, which is social spending and healthcare. Because in that way, you're not going to have a drastic and radical increase in your fiscal deficit. Because let's face it, Ali, I mean, in the absence of a global vaccine, very few people will have the confidence to travel to different countries, even if the lockdown is partially restricted, is partially reduced in June, July. So I think the government needs to get its priorities right here. And I don't think the deficit should rise dramatically, but I think it will. But if I was them, I would think about reallocation. But with regards to the big question, the $1 billion question, will Kenya default, as we get asked quite a bit? No, we won't. And the interesting thing about this is that we normally repay our debt in Africa from refinancing debt. So, for example, a country like Zambia today can't easily refinance their debt because the Eurobond yields are trading at 65% in the secondary market. So for them to go back to the Eurobond market, they're going to have to pay something close to 50%, which is default from the outset. In Kenya, I think we still have an ability to refinance debt, whether it's from the Eurobond market when things cool down, syndicated loans, and we've got a despite the risk of crowding out the private sector, we've got a very vibrant domestic market as well. So I think Kenya can easily refinance their debt. There's no problem about that. But again, Ali, I'll put this disclaimer again. The longer the shock for COVID-19, the more dynamic and revolving these estimates will be from economists like myself.
No, of course. Thanks, Gibran. And Shanif, just last question from you is, and then you mentioned it before, some of the ways businesses can reinvent themselves or be creative. What are some of the sectors or industries that you see thriving or growing out of this?
I think, of course, one that is quite obvious is, of course, food related industries.
Yeah.
Especially basic food items. That's, of course, going to continue to be in demand. And there'll be higher demand, especially if there is a ability to substitute for imports, right? Because every issue with global supply chain, then domestic producers will have to step up to increase production, or to kind of look at import substitutions of various products. So that's, I think, number one. Then, of course, the next obvious one is related, anything that is, any industry that's related to then food production, right? Packaging, labeling, printing, whatever. That, of course, where you will see opportunities coming in. This will be similar to non-food essential items. One example that, of course, everybody has been talking about on TV is, of course, toilet rolls,
Yeah.
and all of that. Those, so the basic non-food items, and again, import substitution in this area. I also think that health, education, and especially online and tech solutions around health and education would be very critical. Okay. So where health facilities, if those who own health facilities, those who run health facilities, whether it's primary outpatient, whether it's diagnostic facilities, how do you expand those service offerings? That would be very interesting to see how that develops. These are, I think, in the next 3 to 6 months will be key areas, because what's going to happen is at some point, a lot of these COVID-related measures will move out of the public sector into the private sector domain. So, for example, testing, right? At the moment, testing kits are only available to government facilities, whether it's in Kenya or in many other countries. That's because there's a shortage of testing facilities, testing kits. But what's going to happen, given the global effort that's going on with all the various global companies, there is going to be, in the next month, 2 months, 3 months, whenever, there's going to be a massive amount of testing kits available. And then that's going to move out of the public sector. If we can provide private testing facilities, for example, could be a great opportunity there. Similarly, online teaching, online tech. I mean, everybody has kind of, I'm on Zoom right now. My oldest son is being taught on Zoom right now from school, and younger one is on Microsoft Teams. You know what I mean? So that is actually the way now people will have to start shifting their focus. Right? I can't, of course, speak for everyone, but look at your area, how, so have resorted to home delivery, so you have to look at all of these changes and see what works for you.
Okay. I think that's about it we have time for. So thank you, Gibran. Thank you, Shanif. I'm sure we'll have a lot more sessions if this progresses for a lot longer, hopefully not. But thank you once again, and stay safe. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.